Darnell Mooney has taken over the NFL by storm since coming out in the 2020 NFL Draft. He has eclipsed nearly 1,700 yards, 8 receiving touchdowns, and 1 rushing touchdown in his first 2 years in the league. What may be even more impressive than his stat line is that Darnell Mooney's performance essentially pushed Anthony Miller out of the Chicago Bears offense in year 1 and subsequently Allen Robinson out in year 2, despite being on a roster with anything but consistent quarterback play and a terrible offensive line. However, despite Mooney surpassing all expectations coming out of the 5th round in the 2020 NFL Draft, he still has to answer to many of the questions that led to him getting drafted that low in the first place. Today we will be statistically breaking down exactly where Darnell Mooney ranks amongst his peers in the NFL and whether or not he fits the wide receiver 1 label that many Chicago Bears fans are trying to label him as. Hey guys, I'm Austin. I'm the host of the Bear Necessities podcast. I have experience working in the scouting industry. And if you guys enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, checking out our podcast, and don't forget to leave a comment telling me what you think about the video. I try to respond to all of the comments and have as much conversation with our fans as we can. The reason why I decided to make this video is because of a series of controversial tweets that came from Dan Orlovsky, which I think originally had good intentions but quickly spiraled for him, and I feel like he felt the need to double down on his take. Here's the tweet. Dan Orlovsky says, Justin Fields has 2 pass catchers drafted in the 3rd round or earlier, a 3rd round rookie wide receiver and a 2nd round tight end. He doesn't have a number 1 or a number 2 wide receiver. His starting wide receiver unit consists of undrafted, 5th round pick, undrafted. If he plays well, he will be in the MVP conversation. Dan Orlovsky followed this up with this tweet. Respectfully, Chicago Bears fans, some number 2 wide receivers in the NFL. And he listed out Mike Williams, Chris Godwin, Adam Thielen, T. Higgins, Michael Gallup, Devonta Smith, Tyler Lockett. Mooney is a good player. He isn't a number 2 yet. Now, many Bears fans have been trashing this take from Dan Orlovsky. I understood his sentiment trying to say that if Justin Fields performs well with his given wide receiver talent, he needs to be in the MVP convo. I don't think that this was intended to be a slam at Mooney. However, that being said, I think that Dan Orlovsky really underestimates where Darnell Mooney is at in this point of his career. However, rather than trying to trash his take, I wanted to make this video in order to really break down where Darnell Mooney ranks statistically and performance-wise with his peers in the NFL. Typically, I spend a lot of time on this channel breaking down film of a player, but today we're going to talk mostly based on a statistical basis. I don't think it's wrong to say that Darnell Mooney has been in one of the least favorable positions of any wide receiver in the NFL. He has dealt with 4 quarterbacks in his first 2 years in the NFL, an offensive line that has consistently ranked worst in the NFL, and hasn't had a great deal of surrounding offensive talent around him. The Bears' offense has ranked in the bottom 5 both years when he's been in Chicago, and he's went up against a top 5 NFL schedule both years. On top of that, Darnell Mooney has also went against most opposing teams' number 1 corner, given that Allen Robinson kind of quit on the team late in the season. For this reason, while I'm typically not a huge fan of statistical analysis of players, given that it can lead you to some wrong directions and it should be just part of the film analysis formula. Today, I'm going to be mostly focusing on Darnell Mooney's statistical performance in spite of these challenges because I believe it gives an accurate representation of the player he is. To analyze Darnell Mooney as a player, I wanted to rank him statistically in regards to yards. While other aspects of a player's game are surely important, especially touchdowns, which were Darnell Mooney's worst trait last year, statistically at least, and also was the worst trait of the overall Bears offense, what yards is typically a better representation of a wide receiver. For instance, Cooper Kupp leading the NFL in yards and another player like Deebo Samuel following in second, you can kind of tell that their performance were the top 2 of the wide receivers last year, and that's pretty typical. Touchdowns can also kind of misrepresent a player. An example for Bears fans is Jimmy Graham. In 2017, when he was with the Seahawks, he caught 10 touchdowns, which was pretty high in the league, but he wasn't really that elite player. Same thing with the Bears. When he caught 8, he actually led the team in 2020 for touchdowns, but he wasn't the best player on the Bears team. Actually, quite frankly, not even close. There was an argument that he maybe even wasn't the best tight end on the team. Cole Kmet kind of beating him out in his second year there. So yards in general is a good representation of production. We will also look at touchdowns and place them in the consideration, but in general, when determining a wide receiver, yards is the better metric. So to start off, I'll describe the process of how I kind of compared Darnell Mooney to other wide receivers. The first thing that I did is I found a big database of every single reception or receiver for a team, including tight ends, running backs, everything from this website, the Football Database. It'll be linked in the description if you want to look at it yourself. And then I took out all the tight ends, all the running backs, and pretty much filtered it so every team only had their wide receivers. From that point, then what I did is I filtered out all but the top 3 wide receivers for each team and then bracketed them in wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, and wide receiver 3 for each team. These labels don't necessarily mean that they are in quotations, NFL wide receiver 1 in the way that we use it when we talk about a wide receiver. For instance, Tyler Lockett was actually a more productive on a yards basis than DK Metcalf for the Seahawks, yet I don't think many people would argue that DK Metcalf is probably the wide receiver 1 in that situation. So this is more so just to rank their production as the top receiver, second receiver, and third receiver. From this point, I then separated every single wide receiver into a wide receiver 1 set, a wide receiver 2 set, and a wide receiver 3 set, meaning that each team's wide receiver 1 was in one data set, each team's wide receiver 2 was in another data set, and each team's wide receiver 3 was in a data set. I did this so that I could compare the averages and medians of productions at those receiving slots for each team. So what does a typical team's top receiver do? What does a typical team's second receiver do? And what does a typical team's third receiver do? And from that, I found these averages and medians that you can see here. You can see for a wide receiver 1, the average yards that a typical team's wide receiver 1 would have is 1,058. The typical average yards that a average wide receiver 1 would have is about 13 yards per reception. And then yards per game, 66. And then touchdowns were 6, first downs, 50, targets, 125, and yards after catch, 375. So this is what the average wide receiver 1 for a team, not labeling them a wide receiver 1, but a team's top receiver would produce. And then I also brought in the median because if you guys aren't aware of the statistical process, sometimes these averages can accumulate outliers. So the median can at times be a better representation of the actual regular amount of production that a top receiver would make. So I also included that. And that will actually be more of the primary metric we use. Just because it'll kind of get rid of the issue with like games played and stuff like that. So we have the median for a wide receiver 1 being 81 receptions, 1,038 yards, and so on. I did the same thing also for the wide receiver 2 set and the same thing for the wide receiver 3 set. So based off of this, we can actually see how Darnell Mooney ranks to these positions based on what he did. So looking at the wide receiver 1 slot or a team's top receiver, Darnell Mooney actually matches it almost directly. You'll notice that the cells that are green will actually represent that he exceeds that number, and the slots that are orange will say that he's missing that number, and the slots that are yellow will be he meets that number. So you can see in about every metric for the median wide receiver 1, he actually exceeds those metrics. He does fall short, however, on the yards per game by about 2 yards and the touchdowns by 2 touchdowns. When you compare him to a team's second most productive wide receiver, he actually matches or exceeds all of them, with a lot of them being quite higher than the average, specifically yards. So the average yards for a team's second most productive wide receiver was 664, and the median was 598, where Darnell Mooney at 1,000. So putting him in this category is a bit of a reach for a wide receiver 2, as you can see here. And then when you talk about a wide receiver 3, he just blows out of the water almost every single category, specifically when it comes to yards, receptions, yards per game, specifically Touchdowns, he's at that 4. You can actually see there's not a huge gap between wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3 in touchdowns on average or median. And then first downs, he blows it out of the water. Same thing with wide receiver 2. He just goes above and beyond that. And the big number that I think is kind of interesting here with Darnell Mooney is the yards after catch. So he, as you can see, just destroys all these numbers statistically. So yes, there is a lack of film analysis here, and we will get more into that long term, and we'll go into that in a separate video. But just based on the statistical analysis, looking at every single team, every team's wide receivers, Darnell Mooney most fits statistically with a team's most productive wide receiver. And that makes sense because he was the most productive wide receiver, had over 1,000 yards. And yes, it is the new 17-game season, so that is a little easier to reach, but still not a whole bunch of wide receivers did that last year. From this point, I also kind of wanted to take a look at Darnell Mooney's specific rankings compared to other players. So I placed him in each wide receiver 1 bucket, wide receiver 2 bucket, and wide receiver 3 bucket. So if you look at the wide receiver 1s, or each team's most productive wide receiver, just as the statistics that we previously looked at would display, he ranks middle of the pack here. He ranked 15th. So when you're comparing every single team's most productive receiver, the Chicago Bears had the 15th top most productive wide receiver. And he compares to the likes of someone like Terry McLaurin. Michael Pittman is right there with him too. Even CeeDee Lamb, Hunter Renfrow, Brandon Cooks. These are all guys that were the top receiving threats on their team by production, and he ranks right in there with them, kind of bracketed by those guys. When you look at wide receiver 2, here he is. He's at the top, really close to T. Higgins, Mike Evans. And now the other thing that I wanted to say is that this is based on production. So Mike Evans was technically less productive on a yards basis than Chris Godwin, so that's why he's in this bucket. Same thing with Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, even though you can argue that. So these guys are more the outliers. Same thing with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. So there are those, outliers here. But when you look at it, he is right in company as far as production goes with those guys. And a lot of these guys actually have a lot better surroundings with them, better receivers. Someone like a T. Higgins that I mentioned previously, having someone like a Jamar Chase next to him opens him up a lot, gets him a lot of cornerback 2 looks rather than the top cornerback on the team. So there are benefits for certain guys like this, whereas Darnell Mooney, for the most part, was going up against cornerback 1s last year. Same thing with someone like DK Metcalf. He was going up against cornerback 1. So there are reasons for this production, and I'm sure we'll go into them in another video later on. And then when you look at wide receiver 3, which is where Dan Orlovsky put Darnell Mooney, as you can see, again, he is just far and beyond it. So if you're taking a look at this statistically, at least, and you're going through and you say, okay, is he a wide receiver 3? You're like, okay, well, he doesn't really look like it's there. Wide receiver 2, you could say, okay, maybe he is a top of the line wide receiver 2, or he could be a middle of the line, or, kind of average wide receiver 1 or average top receiver for a team based on production. So from these overall, you can see that Mooney clearly held his own as far as being a top production wide receiver. And he also does a good job with, he's a top of the line wide receiver too, as far as production goes. I also wanted to take a look at where he ranks regardless of the positioning of the wide receiver. So looking at all wide receivers production, so throwing them all together, 19th in production. This is kind of just a basic stat line for him. And that's including tight ends, everything. So yeah, pretty productive there. So another thing that these data sets might show you is you could come to the belief that, okay, he is a wide receiver 1, but I kind of mentioned previously that there kind of is a shortage of true number 1 wide receivers in the NFL. Like if you look lower down at some of these other wide receivers, someone like Jacoby Myers or Marvin Jones, they were the top most productive player for the team, but I don't think many people would call them a wide receiver 1. I think some people would even argue that a Brandon Cooks isn't a wide receiver 1 for a team, even though he is the team's top receiving threat. So I think taking that in and understanding that, it's important to know that just because Darnell Mooney is holding his own in the midst of all top wide receivers, it doesn't necessarily mean that NFL analysts have to give him that, wide receiver 1 category. In fact, we even just talked about that sometimes the wide receiver 2 for the team, or the player that, isn't as well recognized, is considered to be the most productive player, even though they're the wide receiver 2. So again, looking at someone like a Chris Godwin, who Dan Orlovsky mentions in his post, I would argue, too, is the wide receiver 2, but he was the more productive wide receiver last year. What we can take away from this, however, is that Darnell Mooney is surely within the category of a wide receiver 2, and a high-end wide receiver 2, that is. He is in the conversation for that wide receiver 1 statistically, and production-wise, he just is 100% in the wide receiver 2 category. He blows away almost all of the other wide receiver 2s on here, and one would almost consider these top options to be a 1B situation. One would even consider the bottom of the wide receiver 1 list, or the team's top producing wide receivers, to be 1B options as well. So that's where it kind of looks like Darnell Mooney may be, even though his production is up there with the top wide receiver. One thing that we certainly can rule out at this point is that Darnell Mooney is not a wide receiver 3. He ranks way above even the closest other guy, which is Tyler Boyd. And then the guys after him are drastic step downs in production. And when you look at the averages and median specifically, he certainly does not fit that category of a wide receiver 3, statistically speaking. So we know that he's at least a wide receiver 2, or maybe even a 1B. However, I don't know that necessarily even rules him out from being a wide receiver 1. He quite frankly does have the production to stack up with some guys like even Deontay Johnson. He's only, 100 yards off of him, something that over a 17-game season is only, not even 10 yards per game, 1 reception per game. So I'm not trying to take away from the Bears wide receiver, but you could argue potentially that he is not in that category. And even that's what I think I would agree with. I think that as of right now, Darnell Mooney is not quite at that true wide receiver 1, which I think people typically only give to, top 10, top 15 receivers in their eyes. Now, where I think Dan Orlovsky's take even kind of digresses and really starts to look poorly is when you look at the wide receivers that he says are true number 2 wide receivers. Some guys like Michael Gallup, Adam Thielen, Devontae Smith, T. Higgins, Chris Godwin, Mike Williams. So what I did is I took all those players and took their average and median and compared them to Darnell Mooney. And Darnell Mooney actually exceeds the average yards and exceeds them in most categories, meets the median touchdowns, exceeds the first downs quite a bit, exceeds the yards after catch quite a bit, exceeds the yards per game quite a bit. All these things Darnell Mooney is exceeding. I do want to make mention that there are some difficulties here because, someone like a Michael Gallup didn't play the full season. Neither did Adam Thielen. Some of these guys didn't play. So let's more specifically look at the yards per game, and Darnell Mooney is still kind of blowing them away there. As far as yards per game, he's getting about 15 more yards per game than those guys, and very similar touchdowns. So I actually think he gave some good players that he actually meets. Like, this is the group that I view that Darnell Mooney is in. All of these players are number 2 wide receivers for sure, borderlining being number 1 wide receivers. And on many other teams, they could be the top performing option. For instance, someone like T. Higgins, maybe if he was put on the Jaguars, I'm sure he would exceed Marvin Jones, who's the top receiving option. Same thing with Michael Gallup or Adam Thielen. These guys, they do share their production a little bit, and they could potentially be the top receiving option with another team. And that's exactly kind of where Darnell Mooney fits, where Darnell Mooney can handle the wide receiver number 1 production, which he did for the Chicago Bears last year. I don't necessarily believe that's where he's best suited. Similar with these guys, the Chicago Bears are still missing that big body, versatile, good route runner, go up and get it wide receiver that could balance out someone like a Darnell Mooney's game. To me, Darnell Mooney shares a lot of similarities with a player like Michael Gallup, where as far as not necessarily in their play style, but how they fit into the offense, while Mooney and Gallup have many differences in their style of play, they're both high quality threats, but they have some specific limitations, which make you kind of deem them more as a wide receiver 2 or a wide receiver 1B. For Mooney, the main point of concern for me is his size and physicality. He's more of a finesse wide receiver rather than a box out guy, meaning that if he's not winning his route, you don't really want to force feed him the ball. As Bears fans, I think we can look back to someone like a Brandon Marshall or an Alshon Jeffrey, where they didn't always need to win their route in order to be a threat on the offense. You could force feed those guys the ball and they could just pose a threat given their size and given their ability to get it. Now, Mooney can go up and get it, and he's had a good job. He's done a pretty good job getting some contested catches, even though he doesn't have this great size. He's not the biggest guy. He's a pretty slender wide receiver. But that being said, the Bears, they do still need that bigger guy in order to, really round out this wide receiver room. That being said, many elite offensive teams are now moving away from the idea of needing that traditional big body wide receiver. Teams like the 49ers with Deebo Samuel, who is 6 foot and built very similar to a guy like Velus Jones Jr. He's not the biggest guy and definitely not that big jump ball wide receiver that you're expecting. Definitely not like a DK Metcalf or something like that. And another team that kind of pushes back from this idea were the Chiefs when they had Tyreek Hill, who I think is even shorter than Darnell Mooney, if I remember correctly. And both of these teams, they kind of had these non-traditional wide receiver ones that were being maximized by their scheme, and that created an elite passing offense. So at this point, it's going to kind of get down to, can Luke Getsy, the Bears' new offensive coordinator, take Darnell Mooney to that next level and use him in a way where you don't see those flaws ever? Same thing with a guy like Velus Jones Jr. Is Getsy going to find a way to use him so you don't see his flaws? And while I continue to justify why Darnell Mooney can potentially step up to be a wide receiver 1, I think it's important to remember the context here. Darnell Mooney was a 5th round pick. He's only 24 years old. He's entering just his 3rd season in the NFL and has accumulated nearly 1,700 yards in his first 2 seasons. And even if Darnell Mooney is just a good wide receiver 2, just remember the importance of having a great wide receiver 2 is so important that many teams take them in the top 15 picks of the draft every year.
Chris Olave, wide receiver, Ohio State.
So in response to Dan Orlovsky's tweet, yes, the Chicago Bears definitely should add more firepower to the offense. And yes, if Justin Fields performs very well during this year with this receiving core as it currently stands, he should be in the MVP conversation because he's doing a lot with not a whole bunch. However, calling Darnell Mooney a wide receiver 3 is silly and downright baseless. Darnell Mooney is for certain statistically and film-wise at least a wide receiver 2, or even better, a 1B option in this league. The only question that remains for Darnell Mooney is just how much better he can get. Again, if you guys enjoyed content like this, let me know in the comments. I'm open to making more videos like this. It took me quite a bit to go through this and do the full statistical analysis and everything like that, but I really enjoyed making this video, and it's kind of different than the normal podcasting that me and Reese typically do. But go ahead, leave us a like, comment, subscribe, and if you like listening to podcasts, check us out on Apple Podcasts. We do our full show every week, hour plus long, and we tend tend to do a good job of diving deep and truly analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of this Bear team. So thank you guys so much, and bear down.